The Netherland Pieces. Stories for the Anniversary of the Liberation. For Port Moody Station Museum, presented by Expect Exceptional Theatre Company.
I'd like to tell you of a friendship. It's a friendship that has lasted for 75 years, and it started with the end of the Second World War. It was my granddad's friendship, but it was the kind of friendship that had no borders, so it just grew and grew into a friendship our whole family eventually shared. My granddad, Private Max Eisenthal, was conscripted into the Canadian military late in the Second World War. At the time, he was married and had one child, and Grandma was pregnant with a second. Unlike most soldiers who entered the military right out of high school, my granddad was the old man of the unit at 27. After training in the prairies and Halifax, he was sent off by ship to Europe as part of the Algonquin Regiment. This would have been 1943 or 44, and as a private in the infantry, he fought his way across the horrors of war-devastated Europe until he reached the Netherlands. It was the Netherlands that he told us of when he told us stories of the war. For it was the Netherlands when he found a bright spot in the midst of war's misery. For 10 days in March 1945, he was billeted with a family, the Steinbachers, at a little farm just outside of Boxtel. The Steinbachers had 9 children. He'd been sent there from the front for some rest and relaxation, and the Dutch families had been asked to open their homes to the Allied soldiers. So the Steinbachers took 3 soldiers. One of them was my granddad. My granddad was Jewish. His parents were Russian-Polish Jews who had come to Canada before their son was born. Max, my granddad, spoke Yiddish, and so he was able to draw on the Germanic roots of both Dutch and Yiddish and communicate with his hosts, and they with him. They were fond of each other, Max and the Steinbachers, and for my granddad, he'd found a second home. He helped with diaper changes, being a dad himself and having already studied the art. He enjoyed playing with the children, reminding him at heart that he was really just a kid himself, and he also helped the eldest Steinbacher daughter stand up to the unwanted advances that one of the other Allied soldiers tried to force on her. He liked this family, and they liked him. When it came time for Granddad to leave, Mr. Steinbacher wanted to show his family's affection for the Canadian soldier and thank him for helping the family. So he said he was going to make a feast and kill the last pig. My granddad smiled and thanked Mr. Steinbacher, but said, though he was honored by the offer, he was Jewish and did not eat pork. Mr. Steinbacher turned to his wife Maria and said, "Told you there was something about this, Max." The pig was slaughtered, but also a chicken, and Max and the family sat down together to eat a farewell meal. A few months later, on D-Day, Max found himself in hospital in Belgium. But he'd never forgot the Steinbachers' hospitality, and when he reached home, he began sending the first of many packages to the family. Food, presents for the children, small treats, and other necessities. Their kindness to him never left his mind. He'd kept a sporadic correspondence with the people from Holland, until finally I was to meet them when they visited in 1972. As they sat in our kitchen, I listened to their stories of my granddad and the familiar stories he told in exchange. Our families became friends and shared many a visit both in Canada and the Netherlands. The friendship that developed during those 10 days in March of 1945 has now lasted through 4 generations, a Dutch-Canadian friendship of 75 years.
Mr. Van Heulen's letter. Dear Mrs. Crofts, I'm writing to tell you I've met your dear son, Joe. He stayed with us for a few days after the Canadians liberated our town on the 15th, and he asked me to drop you a note and let you know that everything is okay and he is doing well. We have had an awful time during these 5 years of occupations by the Nazis. The difference between their arrival and when they left has to be noted, let me tell you. When they arrived on the 10th of May 1940, they were so well equipped. When they left just a few days ago, they had no planes and their cars were operating on wood gas. That is the end of Hitler's army. But so much harm has been done to our lovely country. They started picking up Jews in 1941. All our Jewish friends have disappeared, taken to Poland and Germany, I think to be butchered there. I don't know how many will return. I fear very few. They have sent our young men to slave labor in Germany, though we tried to hide as many as we could, under the floorboards, in attics, in walls during the house searches, and some we sent to stay with friends. We have saved many. When a German was killed, the Nazis would just pick out civilians. Numbers of them, sometimes 10, maybe 25. On one occasion, 400 were shot. So you can imagine how happy we were when your son and the rest of the Canadians arrived. We were out in the streets cheering and waving. I will tell you now of our family that's been like a family to your son Joe. There's my wife, she's 54, my eldest daughter, Wilhelmina, who's 29, and my second daughter, Ida, who's 23. They both work, one as a bookkeeper and the other for the police in our town. We've given Joe a photograph, and if he still has it when he gets home, you will meet us all. We have, of course, already met your family with so many stories that Joe has told us and photos he's always carrying with him, so we know you quite well. As they retreat, the Germans blow up every dike, so that in many places we are underwater. They fight on even though they've lost. And the Allies, well, they won't bomb, which would end things sooner, because we're a friendly country and they would not harm us. But all this will end soon. It must. We want you to know it's been a pleasure to have Joe here with us. Although he's only been with us at night, working and taking his meals with the other boys. This is more than I'm used to saying at one time, so I should end this letter. But we, my family and I, would be ever so pleased to hear from you. I send our best greetings to everyone of Joe's family and wish him home safely very soon, so that you can welcome him back into the arms of his family. I remain, dear Mrs. Crofts, sincerely yours, H. Van Heulen.
A brother and sister recount their experience with the radio during the war.
See this radio? It doesn't seem a very dangerous thing, does it? But I can tell you it can give you a hell of a fright. And I don't mean like Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds, though the story I'm about to tell you is about a world war, the Second World War, and I grew up in the midst of it, in the Netherlands.
This was our own radio broadcast, overseen by our own Dutch government in exile, and the broadcast with the generous loan of BBC broadcasting equipment.
There was this particular night we were listening to the Radio Oranje broadcast.
The broadcasts were short, only 15 minutes, but they gave us our lifeline to the outside world.
Yes, they let us know what was happening with the Free Dutch forces, our pilots who now fought with the RAF, making up 320 Squadron and 321 Squadron, and our soldiers in the Dutch Brigade, the Princess Irene.
And our wonderful merchant navy. Sometimes we would even hear from our Queen, Wilhelmina, who spoke to us directly across the airwaves 34 times during the war.
These short broadcasts let us know that we were not alone. Our own famous Anne Frank was inspired to rewrite the diary she kept because of the radio broadcast that asked Dutch people to keep a record of the occupation.
These radio messages were so effective that information gathered by the resistance in one area could be transmitted during the Oranje radio broadcast, alerting other resistance groups of Nazi manhunts, thereby saving lives.
Now, as I have been trying to say, on this particular night, our family was sitting huddled around the radio. The program had just finished when we heard the handle of the front door turn and had the shock of our lives.
It was Hans, our German friend, or so he called himself. There he was, coming through the front door as if he owned the place. We had just had time to push the radio down into the cushions of my grandmother's chair.
It was not too big, built as it was into the empty casing of a camera so that we could easily conceal it. We had made it from instructions we had found on a leaflet which the Allies had dropped by air. The instructions included a directional aerial to circumvent the Nazis jamming the transmissions.
The Nazis had confiscated all the radio sets, they thought, but many people were brave enough to build a set as we had. The radio was a means of resistance. Our exiled government had used it to call for the railway strike as an action against our occupiers. In retaliation, the Nazis stopped transporting food. It was the start of the hunger winter, but that is another story. It was during that time that our German friend came into the house.
And there sat our dear Oma, awkwardly balanced on the edge of her seat, with the radio wedged behind the cushion at her back. The rest of us trembled and made small talk.
The soldier in his gray uniform stood in the doorway and said, "Good evening. All the family is at home. Lovely. Is there some tea?"
My mother moved to go to the kitchen.
But Fenna, being the great actress she is, cried out in pain and doubled over before my mother could leave her seat. The startled German soldier said, "What is it?" My mother, without blinking, hurried over to Fenna, feeling her forehead, and said to my Oma, "Oh dear, the fever is back. I told you she should stay in bed."
And Oma said, "It is so infectious. Mrs. de Jong died just yesterday."
And Mother said to our German friend, "I am sorry not to be able to provide you with a cup of tea, but I do not want you getting sick."
Mother knew this soldier was terrified of illness and was always washing his hands and holding his hanky over his face.
He turned and ran out the door. We didn't see him until 2 weeks later. Of course, Fenna recovered immediately, and we listened to Radio Aranya without interruption.
Good afternoon. Please come in. My name is Liddy, and I am a liberation child. Do you know what that means? It means I came into the world because two young people loved each other. At a very exciting and happy time, the liberation of the Netherlands.
And I am Arno. I am also a liberation child. When my parents met, they had both survived terrible things. My father, like all soldiers in wartime, the loss of his friends, and the daily threat of losing his life. My mother, the Nazis' forced labor and the ordeal of occupation, the loss of her friends, as well as the famine winter. As Lydia said, they were young, happy the war was over, and they fell in love. My father was a Canadian soldier. After the war, many Canadian soldiers remained in the Netherlands waiting to be demobbed. My parents knew that their time together would be short. So, like many Canadian soldiers, my father tried to arrange to marry my mother. There were a lot of hoops to jump through, and people who advised him not to do such a thing. But my father was determined. Nevertheless, he was a young man and a soldier, and so many other people controlled his life. Before arrangements could be made, he was sent home, but he assured my mother he would send for her once he got there.
Like Arno's father, my father said the same thing. But what my father had neglected to say was that he already had a wife waiting for him, one that he had almost forgotten, one whose picture he had carried in his wallet all through the war. And when he got home, his old life started again. The people there, his family, his wife, all wanted him back. And so he tried to bury deep down, away from his heart, what had taken place in the Netherlands. And with his betrayal of my mother came a loathing of himself, which he buried as well.
My mother lived with her parents, and in those days to have a child out of wedlock was considered to bring great shame to the family. The happiness that should have been felt in a celebration of a new life after the hate and fear and death that they had known during the war was blocked out by that shame. When my mother went into the hospital to have the baby, the nurses all treated her terribly and called her names. They even wrapped the baby, me, in a sackcloth so that I would be identified as a liberation child. And there were many, many other sackcloth babies there with me, in the nursery, all marked with shame.
I was raised as my mother's younger sister. It was a sad home to grow up in. My mother was treated like a servant, and I called my grandparents Mommy and Daddy. As sad as our case was, many other children, like me, were sent to orphanages, and their mothers were sent to homes for unwed mothers with other mothers who had loved Canadian soldiers but had been left behind unwed.
My mother tried to contact my father, but the letters never received an answer. I found out much later, going through my grandmother's things, that my father had actually tried to contact my mother, wanting to send money for her to join him. But my grandmother had hidden the letters and wrote to my father, telling him that my mother was now married and did not want to speak to him again. My mother never got over the loss of my father, or the way she was treated.
When I was older, I contacted a woman in Canada. She had been a war bride from the Netherlands and had married a Canadian, and she was now trying to help liberation children and their mothers try to find out what happened to the Canadian soldiers who had fathered those like me. I had only a picture of my father that I had found in my mother's things after she had died.
An uncle of mine told me that I was a liberation child. He had known my father while he was in our country, and he knew his full name and the regiment he was with. With the letters that I had found with my grandmother's things, I began my search.
When I finally located my father, he had died. I asked to meet his wife. I asked for some pictures of my father. His widow agreed to meet with me. I flew to Canada. His wife was a very lovely woman. She said he had told her on his deathbed that he'd had a child in the Netherlands, and he wished he could do something to fix the mess he had made. She told me that even though he was a loving father and husband, she thought he carried a great sorrow from that time always with him. His wife and I wrote to one another for many years until she passed away. Always a Christmas card. She was a very sweet woman.
I never found my father, though I have helped others find theirs. It is a sad history. At a time that should have brought people happiness, the liberation of the Netherlands. After all, it was brought about by the courage of these young men and the brave efforts of the resistance of the Dutch people themselves. The older people who interfered were like the parents of Romeo and Juliet. Our parents were truly star-crossed lovers.
Arno and I are liberation children. We have our own children now, and we are pleased to tell you about our extraordinary parents. War is a terrible thing in many, many ways, and the end of it, which we celebrate today, should be remembered.
The Netherland Pieces by Expect Exceptional Theatre Company. Narrated by Taylor Stutchbury, Paul Coig, Halia Herniak, Grant Volhovic, Linda McLean, Irene Visser, Dean Anderson, Henk Visser, C.L. Young. Slide layout by C.L. Young. This has been a presentation for Port Moody Station Museum. We would like to thank the Port Moody Station Museum and Catherine Mateo for her help in producing the sound for this slideshow. And we would also like to thank those who have shared their remembrance of these events. These stories have been created, some from actual letters and newspaper articles, others from a multitude of stories and resources. Our intention in creating the piece is to give a hint of the history that can be accessed elsewhere.